It is so great to see everybody. It's been a couple of years and I was worried we'd never get to come together again. So when I planned this semester, I thought we would only do Zoom. And then I thought, let's just be brave and do one in person and see how it goes. And this is actually quite a phenomenal turnout for our first in person in a couple of years since lockdown. So it's really nice to see everybody. And I think what we'll probably keep doing moving forward is a combination of Zoom and live events. And we'll see how it goes, but this is fabulous. And before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say a few things. I want to do a few thanks here for a second, because like I said, we haven't been in person for a few years. I want to thank President Jennifer Raab, and I want to thank Hunter, because I've had different jobs in Jewish studies, and I've also been, deeply affiliated with a number of Jewish studies institutions. And I have friends who work in Jewish studies in a lot of different programs around the country. And I have to say, without doubt, I've never been at a place nor know of a place that has been so supportive for Jewish studies. So I'm constantly grateful to be here. And I think that we're quite unique this way. And so this is just another testament to how much support we have from Hunter as we do this really important work in Jewish studies. I also specifically want to thank Eva Bruce Cooper, who's here today, because it's her who has funded our Jewish Studies program in a remarkable degree, and has made so many things possible that we've been doing over these last few years. You've probably seen signs all over the university for the Cooper Fellows, which Professor Bruce Rubin, who's in the back, who teaches our anti-Semitism courses, is one of the teachers in the program. And we do this university-wide call out for students. And last year we had 62 students apply, and we select 12 to 15 of them from a whole range of departments, some with some background, some with no background. And we teach them in seminars about how to confront and combat anti-Semitism. And this culminates with a trip to Washington, D.C. to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And it's really had an impact, because we've been doing a whole range of different programs on confronting and fighting anti-Semitism, primarily because Eva Cooper has been so generous with us in Jewish studies. So thank you so much, honestly. And not only do we do that in Jewish studies, because of our funding, we're able to do a lot of experiential learning. We do walking tours, we do courses that go to the Lower East Side. I was just saying that I went to see Tom Stoppard's new play, Leopoldstadt, which was extraordinary. And then I said to all of our Jewish studies students, look, we can fund you to go see that play because it's so important. So we're able to do this stuff and support our students having a deep connection to New York City and understanding what's going on here. Louder? Can you make it louder? Should I lean forward? Okay, sorry about that. I also want to thank our anonymous donor who has funded our lunches, and thank you very much, so that we could create this series called the Robert Seltzer Lunch Series. And finally, I just want to say briefly, we're offering, again, a huge range of really exciting courses next semester. Many of you will probably audit these courses, ranging from the history of the Holocaust, to the history of anti-Semitism, to Jewish music, Jewish literature and culture, Israeli culture, as well as a really robust Hebrew language program. So we're offering all this and continue to offer it. And again, thank you to Hunter that we can do this, and thank you to Eva Cooper too. So in short, we have one more lunch after this. This will be on November 30th. It will be by Zoom, because we're getting Sarah Biener, who's the provost and professor of contemporary Jewish studies from Hebrew Union College in LA. And she's been leading this huge study of how American Jews name their children. It's called the Jewish Naming Project. So she's going to talk about that on November 30th. We're also doing a number of evening events that you can see on our Center for Jewish Studies webpage. So please have a look at that. We're doing a lot of things in conjunction with the Roosevelt House. So now, finally, I will introduce our speaker. And just the format will be that he will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And as you can see, all the tables have these the ability to ask a Q&A. You'll just have to push the button when you ask it. So I'll lead the questioning afterwards. So Noah Gelfin, who I'm very excited to have here, received his PhD from NYU in 2008. He's currently a doctoral lecturer in the history department at Hunter College. He's a former Truro National Heritage Trust Fellow at the John Carter Brown Library and Quinn Foundation Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. Noah has published several articles exploring the intersection of commerce and region in the early modern Jewish Atlantic world. He's a trustee and chair of the program committee for the Jacob Leister Institute for the Study of Early New York History and is working on a project about colonial New York in the second half of the 17th century. And every semester since I started this lunch series about 3 or 4 years ago, I decided it was very important that every semester one of our speakers be one of our own Hunter faculty. And I've been blown away by the talent that we have here. And I was really excited when Noah agreed to speak with us today. So he's one of our own, and welcome, Noah.
How about now? Okay, great. Thank you, Leah, for inviting me to give a talk as part of the Robert Seltzer Jewish Studies Lunch Lecture Series. And thank you all for taking your time out of your busy schedules to attend today, whether in person or online through Zoom. My talk today Well, yeah, I want you guys to all hear me. So can everybody hear? All right, so I will, yeah, I'm gonna lean forward and stand on my tippy toes here. So, okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. My talk today is part of a larger project that emphasizes the interconnected nature of commerce and religion in the early modern era, and which explores how a marginalized people, in this case Jews, created a space for themselves within the developing Atlantic world. Whenever possible, I try to explore these themes through biographies of individuals and families. In the scope of my larger project, today's material, today's lecture, appears after discussions of Dutch Brazil, Curacao, and New Netherland. And so now I'm ready for my slides. Okay. There we go.
You can just.
There we go, right?
All right, would you like to write this?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah, let me try something. There might be some feedback. If there is, I'll have to stop this. Test, check.
Okay, sure.
You should probably turn off the.
No, we. But if you want to.
This plus feedback.
Okay, how are we doing now? All right, great. Well, today, New York State is home to 1.6 million Jews, which is about 21% of the estimated 7.6 million total Jewish people in the United States. Significantly, New York State has the largest Jewish population of the world outside of Israel. By most measures, religious, economic, cultural, and social, New York is the center of Judaism in the Western Hemisphere. The rise to prominence of New York as a capital for Jewish people is typically dated to the 19th century, when German Jews migrated to New York in significant numbers, resulting in as many as 80,000 Jews living in New York State by 1880. The next 40-year period, from the 1880s to the early 1920s, saw a massive emigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States, with many making New York their long-term home. In the early modern era, though, New York, and indeed North America as a whole, was slow to develop as a destination for Jewish people. For much of the 17th century, South America and the Caribbean were the preferred locations for intrepid European Jews and crypto Jews looking to relocate to the Americas. The reasons for this were myriad, but included the ability to practice the religion openly in Dutch Brazil, in Curacao, in Suriname, and business opportunities that flowed through extended kin networks of Sephardim in the empires of the Iberian nations. However, in the last third of the 17th century, circumstances changed for Jews in the Atlantic world, in part due to their own efforts, and New York emerged as a place for Jews to live, engage in commerce, and worship. In a 1695 map of New York City, there's indicated a building that was being used as a synagogue. And by the 1720s, as many as 30 Jewish families called New York their home. These Jews and those who came after them until the British occupation of New York City during the American Revolution turned New York into the most important location for Jews, both economically and spiritually, in North America during the 18th century, with New York even rivaling Curacao as a center for Judaism in the Atlantic world as a whole. Today's talk explores this community's formation and their activities in linking New York to other communities in North America and communities throughout the Atlantic world, ultimately laying the foundations for New York's subsequent paramount place in Jewish history. An important precursor to the expanded Jewish presence in colonial New York was the readmission of Jews to England. Jews had been expelled in 1290 during the reign of Edward I. The story of readmission involved the convergence of 17th century religious and commercial agendas. In 1655, influential Amsterdam rabbi Manasseh ben Israel undertook a journey to London to meet with Oliver Cromwell about allowing outwardly practicing Jews to settle in England. Both Manasseh ben Israel and Oliver Cromwell were attracted to millenarian ideas of their age. For Ben Israel, readmission of Jews to England would continue the dispersal of Jews to the corners of the world, a key step in bringing about the coming of the Messiah. Cromwell, on the other hand, in accord with educational reformer Samuel Hartlib, Scottish Protestant reformer John Dury, and theologian Jan Comenius, thought bringing Jews to England would speed along their conversion to Christianity, which was a necessary step for the second coming of Christ. Cromwell, of course, was also interested in promoting overseas commerce and believed the widespread connections and special competencies of European Sephardim, evident in the Netherlands' commercial success, would be beneficial to England's economy as well. Some English merchants and ministers, however, voiced their opposition to readmission of Jews on economic and religious grounds. Ultimately, a compromise position was reached regarding Jewish settlement in England, with Cromwell adopting an unofficial readmission policy. Jewish merchants could apply directly to him, and after the Restoration, directly to the Crown for denization status, and thus live in England and trade legally within the English Atlantic. At least 90 Sephardic Jews took this step between 1655 and 1680. At around the same time, Ashkenazi Jews from Central Europe also migrated to England by way of Hamburg and Amsterdam. By 1720, when the Spanish and Portuguese congregation called Kahal Kadosh Shar Asamem dedicated a new synagogue for public worship, there were over 1,000 Sephardic Jews living in London. At least as many Ashkenazim were also worshiping in their synagogue in London at this time. That synagogue would come to be called the Great Synagogue which is also the same name as the Ashkenazi Synagogue in Amsterdam. The other crucial 17th century event that spurred the development of New York's Jewish community was the English conquest of New Netherland in 1664. Previously, under the Dutch, New Netherland had been a marginal location in the Jewish diaspora to the Americas. From 1654 to 1664, a few Jewish people, some most famously refugees from Brazil, others intentional migrants, lived in the Dutch colony. But by the time of the English takeover, the Torah that had been brought over was back in Amsterdam. Seemingly, only one family remained, the now famous Levies, Asser and Miriam. New Netherland becoming New York made it possible for Jewish entrepreneurs in both London and Amsterdam to envision making New York a base from which to take advantage of changing operations in the Atlantic world. In the second half of the 1660s, trade ties already linked New York City to Curacao. And as Jewish communities grew in London, Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, and other Atlantic locations, some Jewish merchants saw potential in New York to play a role in the provisioning trade that furnished the cash crop plantation colonies with food and supplies. Because New Amsterdam was now New York City and an English port, Jewish merchants could adhere to the Navigation Acts, which regulated trade and legally engage with the developing English Atlantic, while still managing to illegally traffic through their kin-based trade networks with partners in Dutch, French, and Spanish locations. So the readmission of Jews to England and New York becoming English combined to enlarge the possible scope of Jewish entrepreneurial operations from the long-established Amsterdam, Iberian Peninsula, Caribbean, South American routes to include now a London, North American, West Indies axis as well. Additional economic factors that made colonial New York an attractive place for commercially minded settlers in the late 17th century included New York City's emergence as a burgeoning port in the transatlantic slave trade and the economic boom associated with King William's War in the 1690s. In 1676, 4 Jews appeared on the city's tax list, and around 10 families had at least some type of residence in town by the end of that decade. And what I mean here by some type of residence is that in this period, several entrepreneurs spent time in multiple Atlantic locations, often following their business and trade opportunities. So living for a time in Nevis and for part of the year in New York City, et cetera. However, by the 1680s, several additional Jews had migrated to New York City and begun to form what we might consider a permanent community. Significantly, it is from this period that the oldest Jewish tombstone survives in New York. 18 Jewish families consistently resided in the city by the end of the decade. By the turn of the century, at least 20 families called New York their home, and a public congregation had formed. For these Jews, establishing residency and gaining licenses to trade as Englishmen was of paramount importance. A whole series of records have been preserved in the archives detailing the efforts of New York Jews to secure privileges to traffic goods in the colony. A few examples. David Brown received a license from Governor Thomas Dongan on October 10th, 1684, which stated that, by virtue of the power derived unto me, I do hereby give liberty and license to Mr. David Brown, now resident in this city, merchant, to trade, traffic, buy, and sell as the rest of the inhabitants within this city and government. When Brown passed away in 1702, his wife Esther Brown assumed control of the family business, continuing to exercise these privileges to traffic in imported goods. In another document, nearly 2 years later, Governor Dongan granted denizen status and important commercial and property privileges to Jewish merchant Isaac de Costa. According to the document dated August 6, 1686, Dongan wrote, whereas Isaac de Costa, having an intent to reside in these parts, hath requested of me that he may be a free denizen of this his majesty's colony, For an encouragement to merchants and others who are willing to settle or traffic unto these parts, know ye that by virtue of the commission and authority unto me given, I do declare and confirm him, the said Isaac de Costa, to be a free denizen of this colony. And he, having by virtue of these letters of denization, the privilege and power to purchase, receive, and take, have, hold, buy, occupy, possess, and enjoy any lands, tenements, and hereditaments within the government, and them may give, sell, align, and bequeath as he shall see cause. And the said Isaac de Costa hath likewise liberty and freedom to trade and traffic in this place or any other of his majesties without any manner of let, hindrance, or molestation whatever. That was a long quote. Thus, with these letters from Governor Dongan, David Brown and Isaac de Costa and other Jews who took the same steps were free to explore economic opportunities in New York and the greater English Atlantic world of the era at the turn of the century. As their mercantile community developed in New York in the 18th century, from 1708 to 1740, Jews living in the colony could petition the New York Assembly for naturalization. Jewish merchant Abraham de Caceres, for example, petitioned the Assembly for naturalization on June 10th, 1718. The Assembly passed a bill for his naturalization on June 20th, and Governor Robert Hunter signed his assent on July 3rd. After Parliament's Plantation Act of 1740, Jews living in the American colonies for 7 years could take an oath of naturalization. Isaac Adolphus, merchant and professing Jew, for example, did just that in July 1758 after residing in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. So, having acquired the privileges and freedoms to live and trade during the late 17th and first half of the 18th centuries, Jewish merchants engaged in a dizzying array of business endeavors with both Jewish and Christian partners throughout the Atlantic world. In the process, they carved out a space for themselves in New York and helped make the colony an important hub in the transatlantic commercial economy of the era. Some of New York's wealthiest Jewish merchants, settlers, are likely well known to many of you here today. The Gomezes, headed by Patriarch Louis Moses Gomez, are one such well-known 18th century New York mercantile family. Born to new Christian parents, Isaac and Esther Gomez in Madrid, Spain, sometime between 1654 and 1660. His family relocated to France when Louis was an infant, and according to family lore, they moved there to escape prosecution from the Inquisition. Eventually, Louis and his family moved to London, where they were able to outwardly proclaim their faith in Judaism. At some point in the late 1680s, Louis migrated to the West Indies, living for a while in Jamaica and Barbados before settling in New York. While in Jamaica, Louis married Esther Marquez. The couple had 4 sons in the West Indies, Jacob, Mordecai, Daniel, and David, while 2 more sons, Isaac and Benjamin, were born in New York. On April 18, 1705, Louis Moses Gomez, who had been in New York City since at least 1703, was officially declared a denizen. Less than a year later, he is listed in the records as a free man of the city, which gave him the right to vote. In New York, Louis Moses Gomez initially set up a retail shop that sold goods from Europe and the Caribbean. Over the course of the first half of the 18th century, he and his sons expanded their operation by opening additional stores and handling commodities from all over the world that were imported in ships that they owned. By 1714, New York Governor Robert Hunter wrote that the Gomezes were all, quote, persons of considerable trade and commerce in the colony. The Gomez family sustained their success in part by continuing long-standing Jewish mercantile practices. Like their Jewish predecessors involved in the Atlantic trade, they typically conducted their commercial transactions in distant ports through networks of co-religionist brokers, some of whom were relatives. For example, Daniel Gomez sent over 100 ships from New York City to Curacao, all consigned to Jewish correspondents there. Louis Moses Gomez also utilized the time-honored practice of cementing business ties through marriage between his family and commercial families in strategic locations. Daniel Gomez, for instance, first married Rebecca de Torres of Jamaica and then Esther Levy of Curacao, while David, Isaac, and Benjamin bolstered the family's connections in Barbados with marriages to brides from that island. The Gomezes expanded on these traditional methods of building and securing wealth by also embracing unique opportunities available to them in their location in 18th century New York. They participated in the fur trade with Native Americans in Albany and real estate investment throughout the colony, perhaps to gain easier access to the supply of beaver. Louis Moses Gomez and Sons purchased approximately 4,000 acres of land in the mid-Hudson Valley in the 1710s and the 1720s. This property served as the family's base of operations in the region, where they also established mills and gathered commodities for the very important provisioning business. Their original block house, which was expanded on by subsequent owners, is here on the slide and is today listed in the National Register of Historic Places as the Gomez Mill House. Like many Jewish settlers in other Atlantic locations, the Gomezes distinguished themselves by providing services that helped both their home country and the larger colonial project of empire in which they lived. For example, New York's Assembly met at Mordecai Gomez's Greenwich Village home due to a smallpox scare in New York City in 1746. And in 1753, the Assembly awarded Daniel Gomez 30 pounds for, quote, translating and interpreting several letters, papers, and other Spanish writings for the governor and council of this colony for the year 1734 to the year 1751. By the time Louis Moses Gomez's youngest son, Benjamin, passed away in 1772, the family had a well-known reputation for, quote, its upright character and benevolent disposition to all peoples and denominations in New York City. Though not a merchant herself, Abigail Levy Franks is another of the well-known Jewish inhabitants of 18th century New York. Abigail Levy, daughter of Moses Levy and owner of multiple ships and a wealthy New York merchant, married Jewish immigrant from England, Jacob Franks, in 1712. Abigail Levy Franks has subsequently, I think, become most famous for her surviving letters, which detail the mentality and struggles of an elite Jewish woman dedicated to her religion in a predominantly Protestant world. Her letters, along with her husband's business records, though, also detail the transatlantic commercial world of New York's Jewish merchants. The Franks participated in the slave trade and imported sugar, tobacco, and other commodities to New York, often conducting long-distance trade, when possible, with relatives in ports of the Atlantic world. And in a strategy that Jews had been employing for a few centuries at this point, the Franks sent sons to key locations like London and developing markets like Philadelphia to oversee the family's business interests in person. While the Gomezes and the Franks were among the wealthiest Jewish families, several lesser-known Jewish merchants linked New York to the developing Atlantic world of the era. 18th century New York Jewish merchants imported European products and what they called India goods, cotton, silk, calico, and spices through their agents in London. Many of these goods were sold in the city, but some were shipped upriver to Albany, where Jewish individuals and partners had retail stores. Lyon, Levy, and Company, for example, advertised that products sold in their Albany store were, quote, as cheap as in New York. New York's Jewish merchants imported from Rhode Island fine heart soap, dipped and molded tallow candles, spermaceti candles, and many, many hogsheads of rum. Rum was one of the key transatlantic commodities in the 18th century that linked the Caribbean, North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. In addition to rum from Rhode Island, New York's Jewish merchants handled rum from Barbados and Jamaica, as well as from Boston. Among the incredibly diverse list of commodities that Jewish merchants imported to New York were oil, anchovies, capers, pickles, almonds, currants and raisins, lemons, oranges, caraway seed, paper, Tenerife wine, Irish butter, coffee, pepper, barrel beef, cordials, cinnamon water, snake root, aniseed water, Virginia tobacco, and much more. Jewish merchants in New York were also significant cacao and chocolate importers in the 18th century. They did this through co-religionist partners in Jamaica, Barbados, Suriname, and Curacao. Of course, merchants in the latter location often acquired their cacao from new Christian kin in Venezuela. Now, that was a long list again of commodities, and maybe that list seems perhaps mundane to us in the 21st century. Or maybe we note that many of these commodities were the product of exploited environments and exploited peoples. But for 18th century New Yorkers living in the periphery of the empire, these necessities and luxury items represented health, happiness, and social standing, and they were enthusiastically consumed, even if occasionally the buyers complained about their prices. New York's merchants exported provisioning items like flour, corn, fish, butter, fruits, as well as furs. And they also established a business supplying horses to their co-religionists in Suriname. Human beings were perhaps the most important commodity in the 18th century Atlantic world, and some New York Jewish merchants participated in the trafficking of enslaved people from the Caribbean. A few also engaged in direct trade with Africa to buy slaves. Isaac Levy, for example, was a partner in the 1721 Crown Galley voyage to Madagascar that brought 117 slaves to New York. According to historian Howard Block, Jewish ship owners carried 377 of the 4,363 known slave imports to New York between 1715 and 1765. While less than 9% of this total business, New York's Jewish merchants handled a greater share than one might expect given their very small percentage in the colony's overall population. New York's wealthiest Jewish settlers, like their Protestant neighbors, also owned enslaved laborers, beginning with Asser Levy, whose 1682 estate inventory lists, quote, a Negro boy. More than half of the surviving wills of colonial New York Jews recorded property and human beings. A 1750 inventory of the estate of Mordechai Gomez, for example, revealed that he owned 6 slaves at the time of his death. Another aspect of the economy that some Jewish merchants, New York Jewish merchants participated in was provisioning British military forces. In particular, this was the case in the late 1750s and early 1760s, when New York became the North American headquarters for Britain during the French and Indian War. Advertisements in city newspapers highlight how these merchants had provisions, quote, suitable for gentlemen of the army or sea officers. Some pursued opportunities that arose in war further, securing contracts with the British military and traveling with their conquering forces. Aaron Hart, originally of London, provides an insightful example of how New York Jews utilized their transatlantic connections and advantageous location in New York to prosper individually while advancing the interests of their fellow Jews and ultimately linking new communities, economically and religiously. In 1760, 26-year-old Hart secured a position as a civilian commissary with the British Army that had just taken Quebec and Montreal and traveled from New York to Three Rivers to supply the troops. As war gave way to peace, Hart remained in Three Rivers, supplying foodstuffs and manufactured goods to other merchants and the French-Canadian population through both wholesale and resale operations. In conjunction with his brother Moses Hart, who settled in Montreal, Aaron also began acquiring real estate, including large land holdings along the St. Lawrence River, which made them landlords to several French Catholic farm families. At a time when it is estimated that there were only 133 male Protestant civilians in the region between Montreal and Quebec, Aaron Hart and at least 17 other adult Jewish men moved to Canada and comprised a loyal population who the vastly outnumbered British authorities could rely upon. As a measure of this trust, his status, and his language skills, Aaron Hart was appointed postmaster of Three Rivers in late summer 1763. Among the co-religionists Hart did business with were a group of merchants and fur traders who moved from Albany to Canada in 1760. After the fall of Montreal, the Albany merchants, including the cousins Ezekiel Solomons and Levi Solomons, Chapman Abraham, Benjamin Lyon, and Gershon Levy, saw an opportunity to capture a share of the Great Lakes fur trade that had previously been monopolized by French traders. Because of their prior experience with the fur trade in New York, British Canadian officials welcomed their efforts. The men organized themselves into a partnership called Gershon Levy and Company, and then divided responsibilities for the success of the enterprise. Benjamin Lyon was to remain in Montreal to establish a base and secure supplies and customers there, as well as in Albany. The rest of the men set out for the Great Lakes with a large quantity of trade goods, including wine, brandy, rum, muskets, and gunpowder. Levi Solomon's destination was Fort Niagara. Chapman Abraham traveled to Detroit, while Ezekiel Solomons and Gershon Levy went to Michilimackinac. For all their expertise and planning, however, this joint venture proved to be a disaster. By the summer of 1763, Native Americans had taken prisoner all 4 Jewish fur traders during Pontiac's War. Eventually, they were released, but the loss of their trade goods left them indebted to suppliers in Montreal and New York. While Gershon Levy drops out of the surviving historical records after Governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton, denied the firm permission to declare bankruptcy in early 1768, Chapman Abraham, Benjamin Lyon, Levi Solomon, and Ezekiel Solomon continued to deal in furs and could all be found splitting time between Montreal, New York, and present-day Michigan during the 1770s. In terms of spiritual matters, Aaron Hart and Simon Levy arranged for Canada's Jews to worship in a rented house in Montreal by the late 1760s. And that community built their first synagogue in that city in 1777. Though the context is different, Newport, Rhode Island, like Canada, is another example of a location where Jewish merchants from New York saw opportunity, moved, made themselves useful to the colonial authorities in the Project of Empire, and thus expanded the Jewish presence in North America while strengthening ties to the hub in New York. Newport became an important outfitting center during the imperial wars of the 18th century, spurring the town's economic growth. Moreover, by mid-1740s, regular direct trade with London had begun to make Newport a competitive alternate entrepot to Boston. These factors, along with Newport's expanding North American coastal trade, led New York City merchants to establish commercial ties to the town. Some, including several Jewish merchants, took residency in Newport to help facilitate the growing trade relationship between the two ports during this period. Moses Lopez, the half-brother of the subsequently more famous Aaron Lopez, was among the first Sephardic merchants to make the move from New York City to Newport in the 1740s. Baptized as Jose in Lisbon, Lopez left Portugal for London in 1726. There, Jose lived with his Spanish-born cousins, the Rivera family, and began to practice Judaism openly. In keeping with the Inquisition-era Sephardic tradition, Jose took a Hebrew name, Moses, once he was able to worship freely as a Jew. Soon thereafter, Moses Lopez and the Rivera family migrated to New York City, where he married his cousin, Rebecca Rodriguez Rivera. Moses and his father-in-law, Abraham Rodriguez Rivera, acquired denizen status and began to engage in commercial endeavors in New York City, and both were eventually naturalized as English subjects in 1741. By 1743, Moses Lopez and Abraham Rodriguez Rivera, along with their families, could be found in Newport. The opportunity to participate in the town's growing commercial emporium must have been the impetus behind Moses Lopez's decision to go to Newport. But once there, he made an effort to ingratiate himself with Rhode Island's leadership by offering his services as a translator. Proficient in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, Moses Lopez utilized his language abilities to carve out a special place for himself in the colony as an extremely useful intermediary. Eventually, he asked the government for a tax break as compensation for the many documents that he translated on behalf of the colony. In August 1750, the General Assembly of Rhode Island ruled in his favor. Moses Lopez was also skilled in the manufacture of potash, a chemical compound that was important in the production of glass, soap, and fertilizer. Aware of the fact that he possessed a unique and valuable knowledge set, Lopez sought to protect and control the source of strength and profit. He petitioned colonial officials to grant him a monopoly on potash production in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island General Assembly agreed and gave him an exclusive 10-year contract to manufacture the product in that colony. Moses Lopez's work translating documents and his skill in manufacturing potash both illustrate a characteristic of successful Jewish settlement in the Atlantic world. Jews succeeded in establishing themselves in a particular locale by making themselves useful to the larger community. Whether it was their ability to supply products and goods from otherwise difficult to reach markets, or their unique linguistic and cultural expertise, Jews created a niche for themselves as indispensable brokers and intermediaries. Many Jews, like Moses Lopez, understood that knowledge was a valuable commodity in the Atlantic world, and the power that they could derive from it often enabled them to thrive, especially in North America. From the 1740s to the eve of the American Revolution, Newport's Jewish population rose to 25 families and 200 total people, many having come from New York. In 1763, the Jewish community of Newport dedicated a new synagogue building, which you can see here, which today is known as Toro Synagogue and is the oldest synagogue building in North America. Of course, the oldest synagogue building in the Americas is in Willemstad, Curacao, and that one was built in 1732. In terms of this beautiful building in Newport, Rhode Island, that was dedicated in 1763, the second biggest contribution for its construction came from the New York City Jewish community. So far in today's talk, the focus has been on the commercial endeavors of New York's Jewish community. For the remainder of my time, I'd like to turn our attention to their religious activities and the development of New York as a spiritual capital of 18th century North American Jewry. Under Dutch West India Company rules, Jews could worship privately in their own homes, but like all other religious minorities in New Netherland, they were prohibited from building or otherwise designating a structure as a synagogue. Dutch Reformed Protestantism was the only religion afforded the privilege of public worship. In English New York, however, numerous Protestant denominations received permission to engage in public worship. In September 1685, Jewish New Yorkers petitioned Governor Thomas Dongan for, quote, the liberty to exercise their religion, meaning public worship in a synagogue. Governor Dongan turned the petition over to the city council, which denied the request on grounds that public worship was reserved for only those who professed faith in Christ. However, the position of the city council appears to have changed during Lieutenant Governor Jacob Leisler's administration from 1689 to 1691. While there isn't an extant document, circumstantial evidence suggests the Leislerian-dominated Common Council granted Jews the privilege to worship in a building they designated as synagogue in 1691. And that building was located, according to the 1695 map, on Beaver Street. And I'll just quickly show you where that is. And this is today's Broadway. In the colonies of the 17th century Atlantic world, Sephardic Jews significantly outnumbered Ashkenazi settlers. As the 18th century progressed, though, Ashkenazi migration to the Americas outpaced that of the Sephardim. New York's history mirrored these larger patterns. While Sephardim comprised the majority of New York's Jewish population in 1700, by 1720s, Ashkenazis outnumbered Sephardi Jews in the colony. Nevertheless, in the early modern Jewish communities of the Americas, and New York was no exception, Sephardic religious practices predominated. The first Hazan for the New York community, which today we would define more as a cantor, but in the early modern era was a spiritual leader and religiously trained teacher, though not an ordained rabbi, appears to have been Saul Pardo, who is also known as David Brown, the same person mentioned earlier in the talk as having received a license to trade and traffic from Governor Thomas Dongan. Pardo was born in Rotterdam and moved to New York from Curacao. He came from a long line of rabbis, and his father, Josiah Pardo, was the first rabbi of Curacao. The religious links between New York and Curacao continued to be very strong during the first half of the 18th century. In the 1720s, New York's Jews employed another Hazan from Curacao, Moses Lopez de Fonseca, and when Congregation Shereth Israel planned to build a synagogue on Mill Street, the second largest contribution after New York's local Jewish population came from the Jews of Curacao. The first New York-born Hazan was Gershom Mendez Seixas, who was appointed to the position as a 20-year-old in 1768. Gershom's father was a Portuguese New Christian who fled that country for London and then New York, where he married an Ashkenazi woman. So Gershom represents the mixing of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews that was commonplace in 18th century North American Jewish communities. As New York's Jewish population grew at the beginning of the 18th century, Congregation Shereth Israel established rules for governing all aspects of Jewish life in the colony, both inside and outside the synagogue. In this way, New York replicated the practices of other Jewish communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Like Congregation Mikveh Israel in Curacao and its parent congregation Kahal Kadosh Talmud Torah in Amsterdam, Congregation Shereth Israel in New York, according to historian Jonathan Sarna, quote, assumed responsibility for all aspects of Jewish religious life, communal worship, dietary laws, life cycle events, education, philanthropy, ties to Jews around the world, oversight of the cemetery, and the ritual bath, unquote. The earliest New York community regulations were written in 1706, though they did not survive. The oldest surviving minute books of Congregation Shereth Israel date to 1728 and were written in English and Portuguese. These records detail the activities of the congregation's Ma'amad, or executive committee. Just as in other Atlantic communities, membership in Congregation Shereth Israel's executive committee was comprised of the city's leading Jewish merchants. In that year, 1728, Luis Gomez was elected Parnas, or president of the synagogue, while his son Daniel Gomez was named first assistant. New York's executive committee had the authority to elect its next members and so possessed the potential to be an oligarchic organization dominated by the city's wealthiest merchants. And that's what happened in New York, and that's certainly what also took place in Curacao. According to the 1728 records, the executive committee's primary function was to regulate internal synagogue affairs, assigning seats and taxes to congregation members and preventing disputes from erupting within the walls of the actual synagogue, which was easier said than done. They were also charged with providing poor relief and often, whenever possible, instructed to warn away impoverished Jews from the city. As mentioned a few minutes ago, in 1730, Congregation Shereth Israel bought land on Mill Street and built a new two-story synagogue, which they dedicated during Passover. The new synagogue drew from the example of the London building, which in turn was inspired by the Amsterdam Sephardic synagogue and included a balcony and separate entrance for women. The Torah was read from the center of the sanctuary, and the wealthiest congregants, like congregation president in 1730, Jacob Franks, purchased seats on benches. Those with less means stood during services. Just as New York emerged as a center of Jewish commercial activity in the 18th century, with its merchants forging strong ties to other port communities in North America, Congregation Shereth Israel also became the center of Jewish practice in North America during this era. North American Jews from as far away as Halifax, Nova Scotia, made special trips to New York during the high holidays to attend services at Congregation Shereth Israel Synagogue. Experienced Shochets and Moyles traveled from New York to Newport and Montreal. New Yorker Isaac Pinto published, which is what this image shows on my right. New Yorker Isaac Pinto published the first Jewish prayer book in the Americas in 1766. And significantly, this book was written not in Portuguese or Spanish, but in English. Finally, highlighting the longstanding influence of New York's community on its sister congregations in North America. As late as 1857, Montreal's Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, known also as Shereth Israel, decreed that the, quote, the hours for commencing services were to be the same as in the Portuguese synagogue in New York. In conclusion, following the English conquest of New Netherland, Jewish merchants moved to the colony and utilized their extensive trade connections throughout the Atlantic world to develop New York into another node in a series of Jewish networks that transcended colonial boundaries and bridged empires. Despite never comprising more than 1% of the population of New York City and a minute fraction of 1% of the entire colony's population, these efforts, along with their willingness to provide services in the interests of New York, like translating foreign language documents, endeared Jewish settlers to authorities and enabled them to secure privileges to trade and carve out a space for their religious community. From this North American base in New York, Jewish merchants spread to other locations, particularly Newport and the St. Lawrence River Valley in Canada, linking these places economically and spiritually. Significantly, their actions helped to shape the development of the Atlantic world, and in the process, made New York a center of North American Jewry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes for questions. If you want to bring your hand, if you press the button, like the microphone may work. If I would, yeah. Yeah.
How are you defining Jewish? For 7.5 million, one Jewish, the practice Jewish, both were Jewish.
Okay, yeah, it's a great question. How do we define Jewish? And you know, in the early modern period, what I'm looking at in my research and my work are those people that take the opportunity, whether it's in Amsterdam or in London or Dutch Brazil or eventually in New York, to actually live outwardly as Jews, to attempt to worship. But in the Atlantic world, given the circumstances, again, for example, there's no ordained rabbi in New York until the 19th century. Sometimes there's not minions, et cetera. Sometimes there's not availability of kosher food. So I think especially on the western side of the Atlantic, there's a flexibility among the settlers in terms of when they're able to be more Jewish than at other times. But yeah, I'm looking at people that are interested in actively living as Jews, and not discussed, for today's paper, but in the example of Dutch Brazil, which was a colony that the West India Company specifically enabled for an outwardly practicing community to develop. It's explicit in their charter for the colony. So you do have rabbis that go to Dutch Brazil. There were new Christians living in the Portuguese colony before the Dutch West India Company took over. And some of those people actually, as adults, go to Amsterdam to get circumcised. So for my work, I'm focusing on those individuals that are attempting to live outwardly as Jews.
if I remember correctly, Peter Stuyvesant despised the Jews and did not want them to be staying in New York. So my question is, excuse me. And what he cited as a reason for not wanting the Jews in New York was that they threatened the livelihood of Christian merchants. So the fact that the Jewish merchants did thrive, how do you account for that fact? Because I'm assuming that the Christian merchants did not like their presence or wish to have them as competitors.
Okay, I think everybody heard that question, right? This is about Petrus Stuyvesant and Christian competition for the merchants. And New Netherlands is a complicated situation. Famously, 23 refugees arrive in late summer in 1654 from Dutch Brazil. The context there is that there had been a Catholic Portuguese revolt against Dutch rule in the Pernambuco region of Brazil, the portion of a much larger place that the West India Company was governing. And that was a 9-year rebellion and war. And so by 1654, when the West India Company loses, most of the Jewish community had already left Brazil and returned to Europe or to other locations in the Atlantic world. And so you're talking about the last sort of people that are remaining, and they were desperate to get out, and they were likely impoverished because the economy had really suffered as a result of this war. And anyway, they end up in New Amsterdam, not by choice. And Petrus Stuyvesant is dealing with a colony that is kind of just hanging on in 1654. It's not really thriving compared to other places in the Atlantic. And so I think the context of yes, he certainly harbors anti-Semitic prejudices, but I think the larger context is he sees those refugees as a potential burden on the resources of New Amsterdam, right? And real quick, there are 3 other Jews, including Asser Levy, that had arrived separately from Europe before the refugees from Brazil arrived, and they aren't targeted by Stuyvesant in that direct way, where he asks them to leave, right? The 23 refugees. Ultimately, Stuyvesant is a company employee, so he's overruled by company officials in Amsterdam. But yeah, there's a tension in that colony. Certainly, as you said, fear of competition, but I also think more significantly, a worry about a drain on resources. That's the way I look at it. Yeah.
So we have time for one last question.
I think that with Peter Stuyvesant, he was paid by the Dutch West Indies Company, and on the board were Jews. And they said to him, you see, he didn't want to let the ships in. They said to him, either you let them in or you're out of a job. And that's how they got into New Amsterdam. So
yes, that's an important point. There is a transatlantic lobbying effort after 1654 to secure permission for those refugees and other intentional Jewish migrants to be able to live in New Netherlands and the smaller town of New Amsterdam. And wealthier Jewish members of the Amsterdam community do petition the West India Company. And so, yeah, ultimately, his bosses in the Netherlands write to him and compel him to allow, right, Jews to continue to live there as long as they're not going to be a burden on the community.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Carol Goldberg, and we're members of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. We were married there. My children were married there. Went to Talmud Torah there, the whole thing. And it's a fascinating history because the Sephardim, the Sephardic service is very powerful, extremely beautiful and formal, and it's extremely aesthetic. And that's not a word you often hear in Jewish ritual about aesthetics, caring about. It's a magnificent service. I'm from an Ashkenazic background, conservative background. So my interest has been in the formality and the traditions of it. In New York City, there are 3 synagogues, 3 cemeteries. I don't know if you know it. There are 3 vestiges of synagogues that were built, the first one before we were a nation. And it's on Chatham Square, a little triangle with famous names. You've seen a lot of the names here. Some of those people are buried there. Every Memorial Day around that time, there's a ceremony. And every tombstone is spoken, the person is spoken about in that tombstone. And an American flag is planted by the children in the congregation. It's really quite remarkable. And they have a fife, one of these little bands from the period dressed in costume, they play and they do all of this. Interesting thing I learned about that triangle. You have to go up steps. It's way up here. The land starts up here. And an architect friend told me that was the original land of New York City, that as they built the city, they had to dig down. So we are lower than the land originally was, because that's from the original site of New York City, that high land. And also, there's something interesting in the character and of the Sephardic people. They're very they may speak 6 or 7 languages. They're very cosmopolitan. They got out of Europe, a lot of them, because they have names like Germans wouldn't know if they were at a train stop, like Ben Walid and Capiluto and Franco, and all these names. They didn't know that they were not Jewish. And so we have a lot of friends who got out. We've heard their stories. They're fascinating stories. And that's it. I mean, there's a lot to say about the character, and they have a much more the Sephardim have a much more laissez-faire attitude towards life. In other words, they like their services traditional and formal, but how you live on the outside, what you do on the outside is your own business. It's not, it's much more open in that sense. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Wait, we're gonna have one final question or comment.
I just have a comment that's really fascinating. Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yes.
You were talking about Curacao. You're talking about Curacao. Curacao hasn't been doing services for many, many years, but it's there. And it's visitors' place. However, in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas has been doing services. They just hired a new rabbi, I think, from South Africa. And it's very, very active. Bar mitzvahs, regular Friday night, Saturday night services, and they have about 250 members. This is in the Virgin Islands.
Okay, wow, yeah, that's great to hear. And I don't know that everybody could hear in the back, but what's your name? Eva mentioned that in Wilmstad, Curacao, that they're not doing services regularly, but you can visit that synagogue and tour it. And I think you can, if you're inclined, schedule something there if you have the money and the interest, right? You could have a bar mitzvah there or a wedding, I believe. Yeah, anyway, I visited it and it's quite an amazing building worth seeing.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm sure Noah will stick around for a few minutes for additional questions, and thank you for coming, and we'll see everyone online for the next event.